Welcome back to the Herbalist Hour. Today, I'm really excited to have on Atava Garcia Swiecicki. Welcome to the show, Atava.
Hi, thank you, Mason. Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Welcome to the Herbalist Hour. This is where community gather, merging the power of people and flowers, the sweet and the bitter to the salty, the sour. Umami, it's time for the Herbalist Hour.
I'm really excited to have you on. In fact, you've technically been on the Herbalist Hour before. You were in a 10-minute segment for the Good Medicine Confluence Roundtable. I want to say
Oh,
that was
right.
a few months back. Are you teaching there this year as well? Or
No, this year I'm probably going to be traveling somewhere else in July. So I definitely would love to go back, but yeah, not this year.
so you'll be attending different herbalism events this year?
Yeah, or different events, kind of promoting my book.
Sure.
My family is right now in the Detroit area, so I often go there in the summer and then try to find
Nice.
a gig or two, a library, a bookstore to
Well, I'm not
present.
sure if you'll be in the Detroit area in September, but we attend the Great Lakes Herb Fair, which is, I want to say, about an hour west of Detroit. So,
Oh,
something to
we'll
look.
have to talk offline about that. I would love to go.
It's a fantastic event. I've been twice now, and we plan on going back in September. So, definitely recommended for sure. Awesome. Well, let's get things kicked off. A lot of times when we start these shows, I like to know how the herbalist actually got into herbalism. So, what was your gateway into this whole herbal thing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a great question. I mean, when I look back, I think it was something like for many of us of a calling, but it wasn't herbalism wasn't modeled per se in my family or my community. I didn't grow up necessarily with someone giving me teas or my parents or grandparents. However, the one thing as I look back, that was very much continued, and both sides of my family was a very dedicated commitment to gardening and growing plants. Like both of my parents did that as long as I can remember. There was always a vegetable garden, and my mom was into like flowers and native plants and roses. So I think I didn't give that the weight that I should until I was older. Like just actually having my parents model like a continued relationship with stewarding land and being in relationship with plants. Like I think that's the heart of herbalism, right? It's to build relationships. So I think when I was in college and I was searching for healing really for myself, I was searching for some degree that maybe represented healing and didn't really find it. Tried psychology, that didn't work. Ended up as a feminist studies major, which was awesome because it was very much the personal is political, and this was in the 80s, a lot of amazing feminists and women of color authors like Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa were like living and writing at that time. But it wasn't until after college when my sister, actually, who was younger than me, but she was going to the California School of Herbal Studies, she
Oh,
invited
wow.
me to the Northern California Women's Herbal Symposium, and that was in 1994. And when I walked into that space, it just felt like I came home, and
Totally.
now I can look back and say, oh yeah, that's like ancestral memory or just memory of being in relationships with plants. I loved it, and I just met my first teacher, Karen Sanders, and I was like, I just want to be an herbalist. I want to make potions. And so that began my journey of herbalism and just, going to that gathering, and just so grateful for these herbal gatherings, these places where people are introduced to herbal medicine. So that, and of course I'm a lifelong student, still learning,
Yep.
never stop learning about plants.
You met Karen Sanders. Were there any other mentors that you met at the Northern California Women's Symposium?
I would say there were so many great teachers. I'm remembering Deanna DeLuca, who did like
Mm,
Botanica Erotica, and
yep.
Cami McBride, and of course, Karen Aguilar and Terry Jensen, who were the organizers at that time. I mean, it was a hub of great teachers. And I would say after Karen, my primary teachers became curanderas from Mexico. We can certainly talk about that. Yeah. Which, where I met in other places. Like, I think herbalism is, being a student of herbalism, I think to be a really well-rounded student is to really learn from a lot of different teachers, because everyone has a different perspective, a different experience, and each teaching is like watering the seed of the the student, right? So we can grow and blossom in the ways that like our expression of herbalism is meant to be in the world, because we're all unique too as herbalists.
It's wild to think that that symposium you went to was 30 years ago now to this.
Yeah, I was
just
thinking about that today. It's like, okay.
So you've been doing this herbal thing for 30 years now. You brought up ancestors a couple times, and I know we kind of wanted to talk about a little bit about that in this talk today. Why do you think it's important to practice herbalism based on our ancestors?
Yeah, great question. And I'll just, introduce like the ancestors I come from, because it definitely has to do with my herbal path. So my father's side, this nice Polish name, Swiecicki, he's Polish, although of course there's, anyways, we'll just say primarily Polish.
Sure.
My mother's side, my ancestors, my grandfather comes from Guanajuato, Mexico. His father came from New Mexico, and my maternal grandmother came from Hungary. As I began studying as a young baby herbalist, for some reason, and this is what I really, again, I call this ancestral memory or just ancestral guidance, like, because in the 90s, this ancestral medicine wasn't trending. Like we talked before the interview, there wasn't internet. You had to meet teachers in person. You had to find a flyer in a coffee shop. You had to pick up a phone and dial. But I just became really curious, like, what were the practices of my own ancestors? And what I did know is that, all of them come from really strong herbal traditions. And then I also was curious, like, and what happened in my life, in my family. I would say the herbal traditions, gardening, like I said, continued. Food, a lot of people, they might not think they're doing herbalism, but if you're using the spices or the plants in your cultural foods, that's a continuation. So I just had that curiosity, and that's what led me to, or I would say someone literally walked into my life, Doña Enriqueta Contreras, a Oaxacan partera, midwife, curandera. And so that became my path of connecting with the traditions from Mexico, which in themselves are very vast and different depending on region, culture, tribal group, indigenous group, whether people are urban or rural, all of that. But it was an introduction. But I think ancestral medicine in relationship to herbal medicine is really important, because the legacy of colonization and, what we call the United States, right? But indigenous peoples sometimes call of the northern hemisphere called Turtle Island, that this, plants come from place. They have always grown in relationship to people, to culture, to tradition, and to like forget that is forgetting, I think, some of the most juicy, powerful, healing parts of herbalism. Like I think about any of our ancestors, because we're all indigenous to lands somewhere, right? We all come from people who were tending to plants, whether as, growing them or gathering them, for years. And so that we built that relationship with the plants. Literally our body, our physiology also has a relationship with those plants. And then there's like the kind of the spiritual context of actually learning how to be a good steward and in relationship with the plants, right? Because if we want our crops to grow, we're going to think about the water, we're going to think about the air. So anyways, what I think paying attention to what were the plants of our ancestors is a way for an herbalist to kind of decolonize our mindset and not just think this plant I have access to it just because I can buy it at a store.
Right.
Because a lot of times we're buying, we have to know that whole pathway, like who grew that plant, what were the conditions, like is it coming out of a culture, how did they use it? So I think another level, I think ancestral medicine is also, as we connect to it, and my friend Leila Christie Fagali, who's actually about to have a book out on herbalism, Swana herbalism, she calls them plant ancestors. So the plants of our ancestors are our plant ancestors. So when we connect to them, it can be really healing, because often the story of our human ancestors is fraught with pain, suffering. Maybe our ancestors weren't great people, or maybe they were victims, or, or whatever, everybody has a different ancestral story depending on their lineage, their ancestry. But connecting to the plants is a way to connect to what I just feel like, again, is that I feel like it's an energy field of the way the particular expression of Mother Earth, the particular land that our ancestors are from, was nurturing us. And so that I've seen this bring a lot of healing. And when I was teaching, more regularly, I would always give my students, we called it the Ancestral Medicine Project. So every student, the assignment was to research a plant or practice from their lineage. And I witnessed this over and over again, just how healing it was to just make that connection, and empowering, and giving us all tools, or, herbal friends who can support us in these times, which for many of us, we're living very, very differently than our earth-based ancestors, right? Yet that legacy of that relationship in the plants can be very powerful. I don't know, friends, allies, guides, companions, teachers, all of that.
Just a quick break from the show to thank our presenting sponsor, Oshala Farm. Oshala Farm is a beautiful and vibrant certified organic herb farm based in Southern Oregon, where they grow and sell over 80 different plant species. The founders, Elise and Jeff Higley, have been longtime friends, so I highly trust their growing methods and ethics. You'll love the potency and vibrancy of all the herbs they have to offer. To learn more and purchase their herbs and other organic goods, head to oshalafarm.com. So thanks once again to Oshala Farm for sponsoring the Herbalist Hour. Now back to the show. Enjoy.
There's so much good stuff there, Atava. I've got a couple follow-up questions. Could you repeat what that project was called? Was it Ancestral Plant Project with your students?
Ancestral Medicine Project.
Would you mind, pretending we're in herb class right now and the listeners are students, or your students? Do you mind kind of just briefly summarizing how the listener could go about and do a project like that? Like, Definitely. What does that consist of?
Definitely. So, the question is, what were the plants? I'll focus on plants, or, plants and plant traditions, right? Because plants or herbs could be used in many ways.
Sure.
But, what is one that is in your family or your lineage, and how was that used traditionally, historically, and then how can you bring it into your life today? So depending on a person and their relationship to their culture and their ancestors, that may be a plant that's still very much in the home, in the family, like chile, and, people from Mexico or New Mexico, as I'm living here, like green chilies everywhere.
Right.
So it may be not hard to discover, or it may be someone has to, talk to other people or do research to find which plants, especially if many of us aren't living on ancestral homeland, and right. Things get lost, whether it's through immigration or enslavement brought to this country, right? Or colonization, moved off one's traditional land, what happened to a lot of Northern Native Indigenous people. So, and what I do for that project too, and this and this comes from my teachings when I was in graduate school in a program called the Indigenous Mind Program at Naropa University, which was a little bit of it may have looked like a detour from the herbal path, but it actually really gave depth and roots and a whole container to the work I was doing. But one thing we were, and kind of the essence there was to reconnect with our indigenous ancestors, regardless of who we are, whether we're, from European people or from somewhere in the African continent or China or Hawaii or wherever, right? So one of the things that we were taught there, because our instructors, a lot of them were traditional cultural elders from Hawaii or from northern tribes or Africa, and we were taught to engage in what like the practices of indigenous science, which is expanding beyond Western science, which is really just what you can measure and like observe, and it's very rational. And so one of the practices was to make offerings, to just literally have a conversation with the unseen realms, which is very normal in a lot of cultures, and maybe Western science is catching up with physics and quantum physics and all that. But anyways, so another part of this assignment that I would tell my students or suggest, because I always believe everyone has agency. So if this didn't sit right, you don't have to do it, but I've seen it work.
Totally.
Is if you know a cultural offering. So like when I worked with my Polish Slavic ancestors, I learned that for Slavic tribal people, it's salt and it's bread and sometimes it's honey. Almost all ancestors like food, right? You could just cook them some food. But find an offering. And if you don't know what it is, I always say what have from your heart. It could be food, it could be water. And just say a prayer, have a conversation, talk to the universe, talk to your ancestors, and say who you are, what you're searching for, what you're looking for, and maybe the why, like why you want this medicine to return into a relationship with it. And again, just that simple act of making an offering, leaving it by a tree or a rock or the ocean, again, just allowing yourself to navigate with your intuition, so much opens. I mean, and I think it's just something about the spirit world. There's some kind of etiquette of information comes through if we ask. So that, that's one part. And then pay attention to what happens after that. Do research, talk to, and one incredible source of knowledge is often the elders in the family. Like I had so many students who it was like their grandfather or their aunt or great uncle who had all this plant knowledge and nobody knew and nobody asked them. And so just asking them, like, what did you do in, Colombia or, Guatemala or, Nigeria? Like, what were those practices? And then interview, I always say record it if you have a living elder who has knowledge, just ask their permission and record it, because that's like a library of information. I mean, the oral tradition that has been passed on generation from generation, then it's in an elder who's holding that knowledge. It is so precious. So, and then paying also attention to what comes, like what we're just drawn to. Sometimes those ancestor plants are around us and we just haven't like become really conscious. Again, it could be a spice, it could be the ginger, right, in our cabinet. And then the plant also may come in a dream, and I've seen that happen too. So after we've kind of identified or it's come to us, it's just starting to work with that plant in all the ways that we do as herbalists, and then allowing that plant to be the teacher, as well as learning like how was it used culturally, traditionally, whether it was in like a birthing ceremony or for weddings or whatever, right? There's just all these plants have traditional use. So, and then, for this particular project, the final would be each student would present to the class, which also was very empowering and transformative, because I think it also did something energetically to the community, which I only could say is like bonding. because when we really tell our stories and we really actually get to see like not just this person, but the legacy of people and plants standing behind them, there's something very, very powerful. So those are definitely some of the steps. It's just, making the offerings, saying the prayers, talking to the living relatives, doing research. And again, it's very different now than when I started, because there is a lot online. You have to have a lot of discernment because there's a lot of misinformation, as we know, about herbalism. And then just enjoying the process and having patience, because sometimes the information trickled in. Oh, and a couple other things I thought that are important for ancestral medicine is sometimes a lot of the information is in what gets called like folk tales, fairy tales, mythology, art, like the iconography of, I'm learning this a lot now with Slavic ancestry, like just the embroidery has symbols that have to do with protection or plants, right? There's just so many ways. And then another important avenue is if you can connect or listen to or learn the language, because a lot of that knowledge is in the language, especially when you get into indigenous languages, like just the way they are in relationship to the world is very different than English, which is a very colonial language, right? And very separate. I don't know if you probably read Robin Wall Kimmerer, her, like she says in her language, there's not a it. We don't call a plant an it. It is a, she suggests that we speak English to say kin or key. Like it is it's our relationship. It's not something that's not living, not sentient. So that was a long answer for all the steps, but it is a process. And I will say people who go through the ancestral medicine project process, and this is what I'm working on for my next book, it's definitely an inner journey too, because again, I think to restore that relationship, sometimes it means kind of touching base into the legacy of whatever the trauma or the disconnection or the loss. So it's nice to do it in community.
Thank you for the very thorough answer. Now our listeners have some homework to do. So I appreciate that. And I do want to get more into your book that you recently published. It's called The Curanderx Toolkit, Reclaiming Ancestral Latinx Plant Medicine and Rituals for Healing. Before we get into that, though, I know you've devoted a lot of your life to, say, Mexican herbalism and promoting that based on your own heritage and ancestry. But you also have I want to say, Hungarian and Polish ancestry as well, which you mentioned earlier. A lot of us are, say, quote unquote, mutts or whatever. And I'm just kind of curious, how do you approach when you're teaching others to delve into their ancestry as it relates to herbalism and ancestry in general? How do you, what is your suggestion for like, because we have a lot of mixed ancestry. I know I do as well. If you were like to give me a recommendation on where to start, do you just recommend what is drawing me the most as far as my ancestors go? Like maybe there's something there in my soul and my spirit that's drawing me to that particular tradition. Or how do you kind of look at that, if that makes sense?
Definitely. Yeah. I especially, so many of us have many, many lineages. And I say, start with where you're at and what pulls you in this moment. And there may be phases. So, I started with my ancestral medicine work very much connecting to curanderismo and Mexican cultural practices of herbalism. And then in graduate school, I dove into my Polish Slavic ancestors and wrote a thesis called Journey to My Polish Indigenous Mind.
Nice.
And then my book, I'll say, and then, so it's like cycles. And then I was teaching and eventually writing about curanderismo. So I went into that focus. Now I'm shifting back to the, so it's just phases, just like we're in relationship with people. It's like, it's hard to be with all of them front and center at once. And yet they all are in me. They're all in all of us. It's just like some days I just know I have to cook kielbasa and, Some days it's like, no, I have to make a pot of beans and, some of my corn tortillas and chile, because those ancestors. So they're all in me. So, and the other, it's like who we're drawn to, but that it's curious also if there's some lineage we have a lot of aversion to. That may be like, and that's actually how it was at first with my Polish ancestors, is we were told to like pick a lineage to work with. I was like, anyone but my Polish ancestors.
Right.
This was like in 2001. And for many reasons, one, I just didn't have a close relationship to that side of the family. I grew much more with, my mother's family, which has a strong like Mexican American kind of cultural identity.
Sure.
But the Polish aunts and my relationship with my father was complicated. But literally, like those ancestors kept showing up, and literally like in two ways they showed up. I got scholarship from Polish sources. So I was like, oh, I think I need to like look with I think I need to listen. And so I did, and it actually became a profoundly transformative experience, including, I would say, one of the biggest blessings was I had a really profound kind of understanding and reconciliation and forgiveness of my father, understanding who he was and like who he came from, and like, the discrimination he faced as a young Polish man in like the 50s and 60s, all of this. I was really timely because I would say in 10 years he left this earth plane. So we just never know, like ancestors, the way they show up. So I think the question you asked, can you repeat about about my book?
Yeah.
So the book came. So when I started teaching herbalism, and I realized, like so much of, and again, so now we're the 90s, early 2000s. I realized a lot of what was being offered had kind of like a generic, not culturally rooted perspective, right? And with levels of what we call colonization, right? Like we might talk about echinacea, but like no one's talking about the ways like Plains people used echinacea, or the relationship to it, or all of that. Or the way the land was stolen and people were moved off the land, right? So I was like, I became really curious, and also maybe critiquing the lack of cultural richness and diversity in herbal schools in the U.S. And being at that point, I was in California, but I was like, and we have such a huge Latinx population. We're like bordering Mexico, and like, nobody's talking about the plants, the practices from Mexico. So I started a class called the Curanderx Toolkit, which I wanted to teach herbal medicine, because at that point I'd been studying for 10 years or so, but informed by Mexican curanderismo. At that point I'd been studying with different curanderas and building a community. So that class started in 2011. And actually, we just finished kind of the last cycle in its first iteration. Well, it was in person and then went to Zoom. But as I was teaching that class, over the years, like many of us herbalists, I had lots of notes and lots of handouts and people asking for more information. And I was like, wow, I have enough material for a book. So the book, the Curanderx Toolkit, is really based on what was a class and the curriculum. And so I finished my book, and I wrote it through the pandemic. So it was a great focus. Sure. I started it before the pandemic, but then it became my project, which was really good because, everything was different for all of us. So I just focused on writing. It came out in 2022, July. And that, is my offering to the world of really, it took me years, or at that point, decades of gathering different pieces of information and teaching about the plant traditions, about the cosmology that informs them, about the ways that traditionally plants were used, like in the limpia ceremony, or which is like a cleansing ceremony where you kind of whack yourself with plants, or baths, we call baños, herbal baths, to put all that material into books so that it could actually reach many, many more people than who I, as one individual in this small classroom in Oakland, California, could, at that point, my classes were like 15 students. So that, I really wanted also to add to the, the herbalism books, just a book that was written, not, in a culturally informed way. And because I also think we need many more of those in American herbalism schools and all of that. And then the other thing that's in that book that's really what's important to me was to spotlight 13 different curanderas in my community, all who are like dear friends or mentors or colleagues of mine, so that everyone could share the story, because I really think it's important to show that this is like a community. It's a community movement. Like, it isn't just like one person on top of the pyramid who has all this information. And we have our elders, right? We have our great teachers, but that, everybody carries the medicine in a different way, depending on all the factors of their lives, depending on their own innate gifts. So I wanted to just really spotlight people, to also document the movement, because in my lifetime, it went from being something that was really curanderismo. When I started, it was really hard to find information, to find books, to find anybody teaching. And I was blessed to encounter teachers who were traveling, maestras, traveling up from Mexico to the US to teach. But what happened in like that past 25 years is really a growing movement of more people practicing. And it's also like a healing justice movement, because a lot of us are, like a lot of herbalists as well, like in communities, tending to people who don't have access to healthcare, whether because they're undocumented or just don't have healthcare. We've tended to people after fires and, all kinds of crises, and created a lot of free clinics so that people can have access. And it's so important too, then when you get, people who for this is their cultural medicine, whether they're immigrants from Mexico or Guatemala or somewhere else in Central America, like, to come to a place where someone's offering a limpia for free can be really profound. So that was the book. It has 13 chapters. 13 is a sacred number, and, cosmology from different groups and ancient, Mexico or current, indigenous groups. And I tried to write about herbalism, but give it cultural roots, from as best I could, as my, my one perspective is also being like mixed race, not from Mexico, not even a fluent Spanish speaker. So I felt like it was a risk, but I was like, I hope zillions of books follow from different perspectives, and let's build on this body of knowledge, because as I learned more about Mexican herbalism, and this is in the other video I did for you or for HerbRally, there is and was such a profound wealth of knowledge about plants. But because when the Spanish came to Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, and all throughout Mexico, they literally destroyed thousands of what our books or codexes, including ones on healing knowledge. And so I just feel like it's also I guess this is where my ancestors are guiding me. It's like, let's bring recognition to this tradition. Let's bring more cross-pollination between the practices and the plants. And we say Mexico, but I'm literally living in New Mexico, which was Mexico. And even before that, there was no borders, and it was just tribal people moving around. Like, there's a major pathway between New Mexico and Mexico City that is ancient. People have been migrating back and forth for millennia. So anyways, even saying Mexico and US is just like socio-political borders that are just modern and not based on culture or indigenous identity. So that's my book, and I hope it reaches my book is a prayer, And it's a prayer that for folks like me who are searching for their ancestral medicine, this can be a map, it can be a guide, it can be a tool. And that, again, as this movement of curanderismo, which isn't just from Mexico, like everywhere. I mean, I talk about that as an umbrella term, because it's just like a system of healing that has roots in all different places that, we're literally colonized by Spain, right? But, there's a different flavor to it, whether it's in Puerto Rico or Colombia or, El Salvador. So I tried to bring in a lot of different perspectives. So that's my hope with the book, that it will reach people who are seekers and be a guide and a resource, and that more people will write. So we have more books, because traditionally or historically, a lot of books on curanderismo have been written by anthropologists. They go and they interview these folks, and they're not herbalists, and they might not even be from that culture. So I think it's important to have people writing like, oh, this is actually my experience, this is my ancestry, and I'm actually 100% a plant person. I'm not just, parroting what I heard. It's like, oh yeah, everything in the book, I had my commitment to myself was written from my own experience with the way I've worked with the plants, and the way I've worked with them, as a teacher or as an herbalist or as a curandera, like, so that it's not just like intellectual. It's like really like based in my lived experience.
Well, you mentioned you're writing a second book. I have to ask, is this going to be kind of a follow-up to your first one, or is it going to be a totally different topic?
Yeah, well, it's still in it's like in its seed phase, although I'm making steps. So I want this, so meaning that it's like I'm literally working on the proposal, but I'm working with an editor who's interested. So that's good. I don't have to hard sell, but I have to do all the, proposal and chapter outline and sample chapter. But that book will be all on ancestral medicine, remembrance, reconnecting. And that book will be intended for people of all backgrounds who are seeking to either reestablish a connection or build on the one that they have with their ancestral medicine. So that will be the topic of that book. And will be very much informed by my years of guiding that project when I was teaching my students. And I'm also inviting many of those students as participants to also share their story. Because again, like, I can only represent my experience and the lineages I come from, but I really feel like it needs to have a lot of representation of different people from different backgrounds.
I like that.
That again, the reader can see themselves in it, right? Because it's really different. It's really different for people who have ancestry from Africa and whose ancestors were enslaved, brought forcibly to this country. That's a huge rupture, a huge violation, and really different than like someone who maybe was rooted in North America for generations or came voluntarily, were able to carry all their plants and seeds, so it's all very different. And I'm hoping that in the process I can find, I don't know if I would say universal truth, but like paths or practices that seem to resonate with a lot of people, so that the reader can again have a guidebook to their own process. And and also with this, I feel like, well, you're an herbalist. I feel like herbalists, well, maybe I can't speak for all of us, but I know myself, part of our medicine is we connect to plants. Therefore, we are stewards of our natural environment that we're in often. And I think relearning that stewardship, that care is so important, like shifting that consciousness of Earth is object, as Earth is this thing we can just pollute. So yeah, but all my books come as, I will say, spiritual assignments.
Sure.
So it's a big spiritual assignment. I've been thinking about this lately, like, oh boy, like got to get all my ducks in a row because that's a big one. But it, again, I won't be doing alone. I'll be doing with community, with connection to my mentors and my elders, and with a lot of prayer and a lot of also recalling my own process. Because I like I said in this book, I'm going to talk a lot about my relationship to my Polish Slavic ancestors and the healing and the uncovering. And I think especially people who have European ancestry, there's a lot of like, oh, I'm just white. It's like, well, that's not a culture. That's not a practice. I mean, that's maybe a skin tone. But I think it's really important for folks with those of us with European ancestry to do our healing and kind of reconciliation with our ancestral practices. And, one thing I've faced is, and I think many of us have to, is like the way European traditional healers were terrorized and murdered for centuries. Like, that's in our DNA memory. And that's like part of the reason why we forgot, right? And then worst case scenario, our ancestors perpetrated that behavior on other, indigenous people or people from Africa. So anyways, there's a lot of like hard things to face. But again, the heart of it is the plants and the earth and the energies, the sacred elements are there, like still wanting to be in relationship to us, still wanting to support us as humans. Like I always say, if I was a plant, I would have like given up on the human beings like a long time ago. Like, you guys are screwing it up. I'm out of here. But they still feed us. They still give us medicine. They still give us shelter, right? So yeah, that's a big book vision, but I'm starting to work on it, so I'm excited. So
I love how it's going to be
maybe 3 years from now it will be out.
I love that it's a collaborative, project where you're going to include former students and they're going to tell their stories. Are they going to be the ones writing their stories out, and will that be in the book, or are you going to kind of like paraphrase what they told you?
Probably, yeah. I'm actually going to ask them to do first person narratives, and I'll probably also do interviews. Again, I think it's just really important to give people like to tell their stories.
Such a good idea. I'm stoked for that book to come out. So you said maybe another 3 or so years.
Yeah, well, since it's just in like the proposal, I'm literally having a first meeting with the people I invited to participate tomorrow, and
Sweet.
that will inform my help me, because I'm just trying to distill like what feels like a big I don't want to say a club, but just a big atmosphere of ideas. And again, to write a book, you need you need an outline and a proposal. And so I need to get it into that form and then talk to my editor and jump through those hoops. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, we will look forward to it, and we'll have you back on the show when it's out. Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we talk about a couple plants? You actually talked about these plants in the wildly popular video on our YouTube channel, The History of Mexican Herbalism. So let's have you talk about nopal.
Yeah, nopal. And I wrote down, so I remember it, the Nahuatl word. So Nahuatl is the largest still present day indigenous language spoken in the Americas. I'm forgetting, but hundreds of thousands of native speakers. So nopal, the Nahuatl name is Tlatonochtli. And so this is nopal, the prickly pear cactus. I don't know exactly its full range, but I know I've seen it all the way down in Oaxaca, and it certainly grows up here in New Mexico. It's definitely a desert plant. In what I talked about in the History of Mexican Herbalism, there was a codex that was written post-colonization in 1552 called the Codex Bandiano de la Cruz, which gets called the Aztec herbal, but it's definitely the oldest written record of herbalism in the American continents. I'm sure there were others that were destroyed when the Spanish burned all the libraries, but no, this one was written in 1552. So nopal is one of the plants in that. And well, as a little side note, like the information in the Codex Bandeirano de la Cruz is minimal. And it's also very much, I would say, sterilized. A lot of what we would call maybe the more spiritual, magical aspects of herbalism is not there. But, again, this is written under the strict supervision of probably some Spanish monk who considered anything indigenous practices of the Mexican indigenous, Nahuatl or Mexica people to be of the devil. So, but in that codex, they said it was used for burns, which, right, you could slice the pad of the prickly pear and put it on a burn. But it's definitely one that has been used, again, for centuries, for millennia, for food, right? We can eat the nopales, the pads of the prickly pear. And actually, this is something I'm growing a lot of them now that I live in New Mexico. You can just cut a pad off and stick it in the ground and just water it like literally once in a while, and it will grow. So
wow.
My little ancestral medicine assignment, and I'll probably have enough pads this year, is to learn how to actually take off the spines. So you can grow some that don't have the spines, but if they have spines, before you eat it, you need to take off the spines. But they're delicious. They're very slimy. They're demulcent. And, in modern times, now they've been studied to really lower blood sugar, lower cholesterol. They're high in antioxidants, just I would say they're a superfood. And then the fruits, which in Mexico they call tunas, not like tuna fish, but the prickly fruit. Oh my God, that's one of my favorite, we call them like agua fresca, like fruit water. Like they make, it's like purpley red. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Just like a beautiful purple red juice that, again, we know things that are purple and red, and those are, again, so many good phytochemicals and for the body, anti-inflammatory, all of that. So a really good ancestral plant. And I learned from Dara Saville, who's here in Albuquerque, that the nopales are like plants to plant for the global climate crisis apocalypse we're going through, because they're super drought resistant, they're heat resistant. If you get the right species, they're resistant to cold. And so they could be, again, a food and a medicine crop that doesn't need a lot of water and that will survive these really harsh conditions that, now that I'm living in the high desert, and we're all seeing it, whatever ecosystem we're in. So, and then another just like side fact about the nopal is there's these tiny little insects, about the cochineals. They're like these little insects that live on the nopal that when you squish them, they have this beautiful red color. And after the Spanish invasion of Mexico, I think especially in the Oaxaca region, there was this like craze for those little insects because they make red dye. And in Europe, like red was really hard to come by in natural ways. And so at some point, the little cochineal insects that grow and live on the nopal, like they were worth more than gold because of that red. So that's the nopal. I encourage people to eat it. Maybe I'll have this.
Absolutely. You mentioned Dara Saville. She's in Albuquerque.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's Albuquerque Herbalism. Yeah.
Do you two ever collaborate on any projects?
Yeah, I'm so lucky because I moved to Albuquerque during the pandemic. So not a great way to meet people when basically you're at home. But I did meet her early on, and we had this parallel lives. We were both women working on our first book and running herbal schools. And so we connected, and she's been incredibly welcoming to me. And I'm a regular guest instructor at Albuquerque.
Awesome.
Yeah. And we were invited to co-present at different places in New Mexico. I guess they just put, whatever, two women who wrote books about herbalism, very different. Hers is all about, hers is amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah. I'm so grateful for Dara. Yeah, and I know you wanted to talk about pericon as well.
Yeah, please tell us more about it. It's pericon or
Yeah.
Mexican tarragon, if you
Yeah.
will.
So this is a plant sister that, like I told you before we started recording, is I think is making a comeback. It's botanicals Tagetes lucida. And the whole Tagetes family is really important. Some of our primary like medicinal and cultural spiritual plants from Mexico are in this genus. So is the Tagetes erecta or cempasúchil, which is Flor de Muerto, the one that is very, I mean, it's the plant on Dia de los Muertos altars as an offering when we're honoring the dead. But this is its sibling, Tagetes lucida. It gets called Mexican tarragon because it has a smell a lot like tarragon. It has little bright yellow flowers. I first learned about this plant from grandmother Flor de Mayo, who's Guatemalan, and she's one of the 13 indigenous grandmother council elders. And she teaches that this plant, she calls it the grandmother plant. And she says it works, it teaches all other plants how to use their medicine. So I'm grateful for her for sharing about that. As I did and it's funny, so I found out about this plant, I got really excited about it when I was living in Oakland. I literally like walked to the neighborhood Ace Hardware Gardens and it was in the spice section.
Oh, wow.
You know, because it was called Mexican tarragon.
Awesome.
And so yes, it could be used as a spice, and like medicinally, it has a lot of healing for the digestive system, and you know, it's a warming herb. So wherever there's cold in the body, whether in the lungs or the digestion. But this is a plant that has a really strong history of kind of spiritual, ceremonial, sacred use in Mexico. And that's what I became very, very curious about, like a very important plant that, again, I mean, there are people, many, you know, places, and especially in smaller communities and rural communities in Mexico, indigenous communities where it's still in use. But it has not many people knew about it or used it like in the north. But it's considered sacred to Tlaloc, who's like the energy of the rain. And there's a lot of, I guess, lore as it being a very, very protective plant, protective against mal aire or bad air, which is kind of one of our kind of primary diagnoses in curanderismo. That's a whole nother thing, but I'll just say that. But it protects against drowning, against being struck by lightning. And then even to this day, in the feast day of San Miguel, people like in the Morelos area, and maybe other regions too, they make crosses of it. They'll like, you know, literally make a cross and put it in their doorways as protection. So it's a very protective plant to this day. And San Miguel is like the saint who then, before he was San Miguel or whatever, the worship or the honoring of the rain energy, Tlaloc, just transferred it and became San Miguel. But I've also used this plant, like even the name Tagetes lucida. I like to work a lot with plants and dreams, and it definitely increases lucidity. It increases dream recall. It traditionally also was used as an incense and in offerings, and also mixed with chocolate. So I just feel like there's so much to learn about this plant. And actually, when I was at Good Medicine Confluence, there was a whole class on it by Lauren, I'm forgetting her name, but from Austin, Texas. I have her product back here. She has maybe it's White Deer Apothecary. And I was like, I can't believe someone's doing a whole class on this. So
that's cool.
I went there, and it was really cool because there was a bunch of us who were like literally being like called to be back in relationship with pericon, or its Nahuatl name is Yautli. So I'm growing it here in Albuquerque. I'm excited that it will grow here. So, because again, for me, when I want to build relationship with plant, if it's one that I can grow in my environment, then I feel like that's a really primary way to learn about it. So I'm excited, and I make a product that has it in it, which I call it Luz de Abuelita, because one of the properties of this plant, and it's another Tagetes, the lemonii, which is more native to like more like the southern, more temperate regions, and it's a very popular landscaping plant in at least the Bay Area. It's called Mexican marigold. But both of those plants seem to literally bring dreams of grandmothers. And this is just, again, anecdotal evidence giving it to dozens of students. So anyways, I have it in a product. So I'm learning about it and just building my relationship with pericon, Tagetes lucida.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. That one definitely stuck out to me as well. I'm gonna have to give that a shot. I noticed mugwort is a Artemisia, which is also an Asteraceae plant family, and it looks like Tagetes is Asteraceae as well. I was just kind of curious if how do you take the Tagetes when you're trying to work with it for dreams? Do you tincture it? Do you burn it? Do you do all the above? Take it as tea?
Yeah, all the above. Like I've made it as a tincture and as a flower essence primarily. But I did when I met the folks at Good Medicine, and I guess in Texas it grows like huge, and so they gave me a bag of it. So I have actually burned it because that's one of the traditional ways to use it, or thrown it into like tea that I'm making. And actually, when I've been growing in my garden, I would add it to my my daily tea. So yeah, all of the above.
Awesome. Throw in like some of the dried flowers into a pillow or something like that too. Yeah.
Sure.
Sweet. Well, why don't you tell us about this upcoming class you have on the Thinkific platform? It's also titled the Curanderx Toolkit.
Right. Yeah.
For that or anything?
Yeah. So I'm after starting that class that was in like for a decade in person primarily until 2020. And then it became a Zoom class. And now I'm going to upload it, or I'm creating content that would be, Thinkific is just a platform where you can just buy the class and do your self-paced, and there'll be recordings.
Nice.
And probably I will do it when I launch it. There'll also be some live sessions and opportunities to like have Q&A, like that hybrid thing that people are playing around with.
Totally.
And I want to, I am continuing teaching, and right now one of my main classes is a smaller class that is full. I call it Curanderx Evolution, that I'm co-teaching with a friend of mine, Veronica Juarez. But I still want to have that information and those teachings available again to the wide world. So it will be following kind of the template of the book. So we'll talk about some history and traditional use of plants, how to build relationship with plants, and certainly highlight some of the plants that we've been talking about, so folks can get just kind of an overview introduction to herbal medicine from at least a Mexican-American curanderismo perspective. So yeah, I'm hoping, everything always takes longer than you think. I was like, I'm going to launch in January, but
right.
Still working on the back end. But yeah, folks are interested, just sign up on my email list or follow me on Instagram, and they'll be notified when it's launching.
So all links will be in the podcast show notes and the YouTube description and all that, but it's ancestralapothecary.com. Sweet, Atava. Well, any other upcoming projects you'd like to promote or anything?
Yeah, that's the main one for now. Working on a second book is going to be my main focus, and then working on this class that people can attend at their own timing, their own pace. Yeah, I will say people who are interested in curanderismo, like in a general way, it's not my project, but I participate in it. There's a curanderismo class at the University of New Mexico every July, and it's a great place to meet a lot of different practitioners and healers. And it's really like a convergence. People come from Mexico, they come from other Latin American countries, from all across the Northern Hemisphere, to just converge and to share. So that's just a good place. If people always ask me, like, I want to learn more.
Sure.
So I say my book is a good place. There'll be more classes that I'll be teaching. And then there's a lot of other, teachers out there. So it's, again, we're in a time of flowering. There's a lot of offerings, and a lot of teachers can share on Zoom. So you don't even have to be where they live.
What's that event called?
Well, if it's called Traditional Medicine Without Borders, but if you just Google Curanderismo, UNM, University of New Mexico, you'll come to the page. And yeah.
Awesome. I'll do my best to leave the link in the podcast show notes. So
I could send it to you too.
That'd be fantastic. Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun. You've inspired me to learn more. Yeah. I love talking about this ancestry stuff. It seems to be gaining in popularity, and it's definitely something I need to start thinking about more and incorporating more in my life and everything. So awesome, Atava. Well, any closing thoughts before we wrap up and get out of here?
Yeah, I'm just grateful for the opportunity, and I hope these words, again, bring people into deeper relationship with plants, with their plant ancestors, with their ancestors, and know that whoever you are, you come from a people who from time immemorial have been in relationship with plants in many, many ways, and that even if it seems difficult or impossible to reconnect, that it can happen. Like the ancestors and the plant ancestors, they're just waiting for you to say yes. So
that's wonderful. And I know you inspired a lot of people, including myself, and I'm gonna do that homework. And dear listener, you should do that homework as well, and I'll report back with my findings and everything. So
awesome.
Thank you so much again, Atava. That's gonna do it for this episode of the Herbalist Hour, and we'll see you next time, all right?
Bye.
Thanks so much for watching today's episode of the Herbalist Hour. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want more great herbal content, be sure to subscribe to our HerbRally YouTube channel. If you enjoy these Herbalist Hour episodes and you'd like to join us live, you can do so by becoming an HerbRally Schoolhouse member. Learn more at herbally.com/schoolhouse. And if you want to get your first 30 days for free, use coupon code YouTube30 at checkout. So our HerbRally Schoolhouse members get access to exclusive video classes, monographs, and a lot more herbal community discounts, along with joining these live Herbalist Hour interviews. So one more time, herbally.com/schoolhouse. Enter coupon code YouTube30 at checkout to get your first 30 days for free. All right, we'll see you in the next episode, and take care.